Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this program. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Good, beautiful afternoon on the 29th day of July. My calendar is all messed up. This is Bill O'Brien. What a pleasure to be with you on such a gorgeous day here in the east, in the mountains. We're coming to you live from southern West Virginia, and it is absolutely a gorgeous day. It appears that we skipped the end of summer and went right into fall, but in this area, the fall is just dream weather. It is low humidity, in the 70s. The sun is shining. The clouds are puffy white. It is just gorgeous. What a day to relax and maybe have a little bit of conversation. I hope that your weekend was a wonderful one. And I hope that what we can do to make your contribution to today's program worth your valuable time. I mean that. I appreciate so much for you, for your willingness to tune into our program today. I appreciate you, and I take very seriously your commitment of time to our program. I commit myself every day to the idea that as much as possible, I'm going to make the commitment of your time well worth your while. That's my goal. Sometimes we make it, sometimes we don't, I think, but it's worth shooting for. When we start to take these things for granted, that's the time to begin to look for something new and something different. Again, thank you for tuning in to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. This is our first program of the week. Appreciate you being with us. Invite you to participate actively in our program by picking up the phone and giving us a call. A listener suggested some weeks ago, I've mentioned this before, but it just occurred to me now that it would be worthwhile to mention it again. Our emailer made reference to the fact that more often than not I'm asking for callers that don't call, and his argument is that the nature of the program is such that a lot of it is informational, and a lot of it is based on the idea that the listener is a little bit reluctant to call up and change the train of thought or whatever, and I don't want you to feel that way. And what he suggested is that the break at the top of the hour between the first and second hour is an ideal time to really promote calls, because it is a break. It is a time before we get into anything substantive in the second hour. That would be a wonderful time for people to call and give their reaction to the first hour, or if there's something else that seems relevant and the listener wants to call and share his thinking or ideas or whatever with the rest of our audience, then that's a perfect time to do it, and I wanted to mention that. Our phone number, area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My personal email address, if you are inclined to send me an email and share your ideas on a one-on-one basis, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906, all one word, @gmail.com. There are a number of issues that seems to me to be relevant. We made a couple of stabs in our programming last week into the beginnings of some labor history in the early and mid 19th century. In the United States. I really do believe that is significant, because it speaks to the background, to consideration, serious consideration of the whole idea of codetermination that we talked about earlier. The change in emphasis with the idea that in the nature of the competitive world that we find ourselves in the 21st century, it is much more important than ever that American producers and the deliverers of services. Not just manufacturing, because we've gone way beyond manufacturing. We're into the development and the creativity associated with software development and programming, computer programming, and the communication revolution that is underway, has been underway for a while, and will be underway for a long time to come, it looks like. There's a new day out there, and it speaks to the need, it seems to me, it has seemed to me for some time, to the idea that we've got to basically think out of the box a little bit in terms of the traditional relationships between management and labor, the traditional industrial model of relationships that come out of the 19th and 20th centuries, as we begin to think about something different in the 21st century. And I think if you think back to the email we got from Sweden, from Scott, several weeks ago, and his explanation of codetermination as it works in Sweden and as it works in Northern and Western European countries, it seems to me, in fact, it seemed to Scott, that the updating, if you will, the bringing into the 21st century of the American constitutional system would speak to the idea that we look very seriously at the social democracies that are operative in these countries, especially the relationship between management and labor, which seems to be at the heart of those relationships. Back to the competition. If you think back more than 10 years now, more than a decade, to Tom Friedman's really prominent, wonderful book called The World is Flat. He was predicting much of what indeed has happened, that with the communication revolution and the increase in technology, primarily the use of the internet, what we have reached is a kind of world which is much more competitive and much more interactive and interdependent than any world we've ever experienced before. And for producers, manufacturers, and investors in the United States, it seems to me, it really does call for a new day and a new way of addressing new problems, and we can't continue to do it in old-fashioned ways. And I think codetermination or something in that area is something that we really need to think about. It seems to me a little bit defeating and a little bit depressing when, if you go on Wikipedia and you basically type in codetermination, what you're going to find is a positive relationship between management and labor, where producers have realized that the greatest contributions to the product or the service being marketed, not only nationally but internationally, the greatest contributions are going to come from the people actually involved in the doing of the service or the manufacture of the product, whatever it happens to be. We have got to basically break this idea of the hostility and the negativism that has traditionally existed between labor and management in this country. And we have got to replace it with something that is much more positive and makes American production and American contribution to the internet, to the marketplace, a lot more competitive and a lot more rewarding for a variety of different people. This is the economy of the 21st century and thereafter. This is the world that we will be in. We will either master it, I don't mean dominate it, I mean participate creatively and constructively and substantively in it, or we will be left by the wayside. Tom Friedman has said that in numerous ways, not only in the book but in articles that have followed up that book. And in his most recent book, he reiterates exactly the same kinds of things. That the traditional idea, the traditional approach that we have had to education, where our primary job, our first priority, has long seemed to be to separate the wheat from the chaff, if you will, or to separate those who can benefit from a high-quality education and those who cannot. And what we have traditionally done is eliminate or exclude a large percentage of our population from the game in a number of ways. And it seems to be the driving approach to our whole approach to education in America. The idea that what we need to do is pit individual against individual, measure the differences, measure the competencies, skim the cream, as Jefferson mentioned in 1779, skim the creams of ability, and then go on. The result has been that we continue to work with 15 to 20% of our population, assuming that most of the creativity and most of the good things that are going to happen in and for the American economy are going to come from that 20%. And what we do is render the remaining 80% as kind of outside the box looking in, so to speak. It is very, very clear to me that we have got to change our whole modus operandi. We have got to basically begin to look at the idea of educating all of our people, finding out the skills and talents of abilities of individuals, and do everything we can do to cultivate these individuals and to find ways to help them access the system and access their own individual success and opportunities within that system. When we do that, I would suggest to you, we remain competitive, we remain at the top of the heap, so to speak. If we continue to resist it, I think that we will suffer accordingly. That's the system, that's the approach that I wanted to deal with, and I wanted to do a little bit of historical background by going back in the 19th century and looking at the origins of some of the assumptions that have driven our labor movement and some of the ways that labor has responded or tried to respond to it, and the results, positive and negative, that we've had from it. Before we get into that, we've only 10, 11 minutes into today's program. I wanted to share with you a letter. One of our listeners, regular listeners, in fact, one of the Horns regular listeners, from Texas, Betsy. I know Bob Kincaid refers to her, calls her Betsy, Texas Betsy. And I, apologetically do the same thing. She was kind enough to share a letter with me that was sent to the North Carolina Assembly from a teacher. The date on this is July 25th, which was this past Thursday, today being the 29th, 4 days ago. And it is it is a letter from a teacher in North Carolina to the North Carolina General Assembly. And the title of her letter is, "I Can No Longer Afford to Teach." I think there's a lot in this letter. I've read it 3 or 4 times this weekend because I think it is something that everybody needs to hear. I think it's that powerful. And while I'm not going to do that because I don't want to take up our entire program on the content of this letter. But I would suggest to you that if you look up this letter and look at the comments that the letter elicited, you'll find several hundred. I read through comment after comment after comment about this letter, and I'll get to it after we look at the letter. I'll make reference to some of the comments, but I probably looked at more than 100 of the comments to this letter. I think it's an incredible compliment to the person who wrote this letter. The fact that there are that many comments to it. I think this letter touches a nerve. It touches a nerve in education in America, clearly, which is one reason why I'd like to take our time here on the Virtual Center to share the content of the letter with you. But it seems to me that it even speaks more directly than that to the whole idea of the priorities within our constitutional system. Some of the content of this letter speaks to that. More specifically, many of the comments that the letter elicited, it seemed to me, speak even more so to that kind of content about the nature of our priorities. And I would suggest to you, just in my comments over the first 5 or 6 minutes of today's program about American competitiveness, I would suggest that part of that competitiveness involves rethinking and the reordering of our priorities. And I'm not going to get into that right now, but if you'll bear with me, I'd like to share with you the contents of this letter and I'd like to make a few comments. But more important, I solicit yours. I thank Betsy for the letter. I told her in my response to her that not only did I thank her, but I mentioned to her that I hope to open today's program with this letter and give our listeners the opportunity to respond to it as well, even though there have been, as I mentioned, I think the last time I looked, there were something like 384 or 324 specific comments to this letter on the internet, all of which you can get if you go to the letter itself. So again, if you Google letter to the North Carolina General Assembly entitled "I Can No Longer Afford to Teach," July 25th, 2013, you'll get the letter and you'll get the comments to it. So with that, let me share the letter with you, make a few comments, and again, throughout, I invite yours. If you are inclined to comment, by all means, that's the reason that I'm sharing, that I feel that this is totally within the context of our program. I don't think this is in any way a tangent. We've spent a lot of time on education. We've talked about the extent to which the whole idea of America's constitutional potential seems to me to be tied up directly with the system of education that we finally become comfortable with in our nation. I like to believe that we're not comfortable with this one because this one clearly for so many people is not working. Let me share this with you. Dear members of the North Carolina General Assembly, the language in this letter is blunt because the facts are not pretty. Teaching is my calling, a true vocation, a labor of love, but I can no longer afford to teach. That's the first sentence of the letter. Let me just pause there for a moment and share something with you. When we were doing our PRISM grant and working with our teachers, we were talking about how our teachers teaching their youngsters how to write a good essay. And one of the issues that we talked about was the opening sentence of a good paragraph or a good essay. And what we talked about is a hook sentence, a grabber. Something right at the beginning that really grabs your attention and really forces you to continue to read on. And the author of this letter, and I keep using that phrase, so let me use the lady's name. Lindsay Kosmala First, F-U-R-S-T is her last name. The first name is Lindsay. Lindsay's grabber, the hook in this letter, is pretty powerful. The language is blunt because the facts are not pretty. Teaching is my calling, a true vocation, a labor of love, but I can no longer afford to teach. I moved to North Carolina to teach and to settle into a place I love. My children were born here. We have no plans to leave. I reassured my family in Michigan, shocked at my paltry pay and health benefits, that North Carolina had an established 200-year history of placing a high value on public education and that things would turn around soon. So Lindsay's family, Lindsay obviously relocated from Michigan to North Carolina, and in the process, the implication here is, took a substantial pay cut which shocked many of her friends as to why she would do this. But her response was that she had faith that a 200-year history in North Carolina of putting a high value on public education would turn her personal situation around. Back to the letter. When I moved here and began teaching in 2007, $30,000 was a major drop from the $40,000 starting salaries being offered by districts all around me in Metro Detroit. But it was fine for a young single woman sharing a house with roommates and paying off student loans. Classic example of somebody just going into public education. $30,000 a year as a starting salary. If you are young, single, no children, no home to maintain, $30,000 is a worthwhile entry-level salary for entry into the profession, even though for this particular person it was a $40,000 drop, a $10,000 loss in salary by relocating from the Detroit area. However, over 6 years later, $31,000 is wholly insufficient to support my family. So in the 6 years since Lindsay came to North Carolina, she now has a family to support. Her salary from 2007 has increased $1,000. We all know that inflation and the costs of utilities and all the rest of it, healthcare and everything else, far exceeds $1,000 in pay increases over a 6-year period. It's wholly insufficient to support my family, she said. So insufficient, in fact, that my children qualify for and use Medicaid as their medical insurance. And since there is simply no way to deduct $600 per month from my meager take-home pay in order to include my husband on my health plan, he's gone uninsured. We work opposite shifts to eliminate health care costs. What we have in this paragraph is a classic example of a young family struggling, unable to pay health care costs, so husband and wife work different shifts so they can take turns taking care of the children while they're home. $600 a month in order to include her spouse on her health care plan, so he goes uninsured, which presumably for a young parent implies that there are as yet there are no serious health costs. But for how long? So this paragraph speaks so much to the struggling middle class, entry level into the profession, student debts to pay off, student loans to pay off, unable to basically access the healthcare system for the entire family. The children are on Medicaid, the husband goes uninsured, and what we're talking about is a paycheck to paycheck kind of existence. This is after 6 years in the system. Back to the letter. The public discourse on public assistance is that it is a stopgap, a safety net to keep people from falling until they can get back on their feet. Public discourse on public assistance. What we talk about is that our safety net is there primarily to keep people from falling totally to the bottom, rather providing them a temporary stopgap measures until they can get back on their feet and back into the fray. But as I see no end in sight to the assault on teacher pay, I will do what I have to do to support my family financially. We never wanted or expected to live in luxury. We did, however, hope to be able to take our little girls out for an ice cream, or not wonder where we will find the gas money to visit their grandparents. And so even though I am a great teacher from a family of educators and public servants, and never imagined myself doing anything else, I am desperately seeking a way out of the classroom. And nothing about education in North Carolina breaks my heart more. Here is a teacher who's been in the system for 6 years, unabashedly refers to herself as a wonderful teacher, refers to her desire to teach as a calling, as a vocation, as a labor of love. It's obvious for anybody that's thought about it, is that clearly those are the ingredients that make for a good teacher. So I personally, and I'm assuming those of you listening as well, would agree that Lindsay's comments about the quality of her own teaching are probably not misplaced. She goes on, I will make no apologies for saying that I am a great teacher. I run an innovative classroom where the subject matter is relevant and the standards are high. My teaching practice has resulted in consistently high evaluations from administrators, positive feedback from parents, and documented growth in students. Very simply, I would suggest to you that's what it's all about. That's what everybody says it's all about. Good evaluations, good evaluations from parents, from administrators. Most importantly, her students are able to perform. I realize that no one in Raleigh will care or feel the impact when this one teacher out of 80,000 leaves the classroom. I understand. However, my 160 students will feel the impact, and 160 more the next year, and the next. My professional learning community, teachers around the country with whom I collaborate, will be impacted, and their students as well. Young teachers become great when they are mentored by experienced, effective educators, and all their students are impacted as well. When quality teachers leave the classroom, the loss of mentors is yet another effect. This is how the quiet and exponential decline in education happens. Wow. Think about what that paragraph from Lindsay speaks to. It speaks to the idea of what happens when one high-quality teacher leaves the profession. There are 80,000 in North Carolina, is what she's saying. Nobody's going to notice that I'm gone. But my students will. The students that I would have had next year will, and the year after that. The community, the professional community that I associate with and I function in, teachers around the country with whom I communicate and collaborate, they'll be affected. Their students will be affected. Young teachers become great teachers when they interact with other great teachers, when they are mentored by experienced, effective educators, and all their students are affected by this. When a quality teacher leaves the classroom, the loss of the mentoring that is associated with that is another negative impact. And then she says, I think this is profound, this is how the quiet and exponential decline in education happens. The best people are leaving it. One of the things I would almost put this parenthetically as an addition to Lindsay's thinking. Many people that we know would be high-quality teachers find it difficult to access the system, let alone get in it for a few years and then leave it. Because one of the things we have found is that the profession has resorted to the idea of protecting its own job protection in order to control access. Part of the reason for controlling access is to control quality. I don't dispute that. I don't argue against that. I support that. Because the people that make the decisions about what happens in education at the state level, the county level, the local school system level, march to a different drum. They are accountable to different people for different sets of measures other than the quality that happens within the interaction between teacher and student. The quality educational experience that happens or doesn't happen in the classroom is the issue that we seek to measure. That's what we try to get our arms around, to get a handle on, if you will. But the fact of the matter is the people that are made to make the calls on that, the people who evaluate our teachers and evaluate education, they are the ones that are pushing the standardized tests and performance on these tests, because they really don't have what they need in order to make substantive decisions on the basis of substantive considerations. So they basically redefine the measures of accountability in order to fulfill their responsibilities to make decisions. And the result is they impose tests upon tests upon tests upon tests. And their assumption is the way we evaluate good teachers is to evaluate what kids are learning. And so by subjecting children to a seemingly endless battery of tests, that's the way that these folks find that they must evaluate teachers. And a quality teacher like Lindsay, and Lord knows there are many more, is left to respond to that and try to respond to those kinds of measures, those kind of accountability measures, and at the same time maintain a high quality level of interaction between teacher and student in the classroom. And at the same time, those who are accountable for keeping budgets down and under control, they are the ones that over 6 years have been able to grant a total of $1,000 pay increase to a teacher like this. Higher teacher pay may be unpopular, Lindsay says, and I am aware it's difficult to see the connection between teacher pay and a quality education for students. So I'll try to make it clear, she said. Paying me a salary on which I can live means I can stay in the classroom. And keeping me in the classroom means thousands of students over the next decade will get a quality education from me. It's that simple. From Lindsay's perspective, the equation is relatively easy to decipher. The difference is she's not the one that makes those determinations. Somebody that is operating within a totally different set of accountability measures is making that kind of decision. And Lindsay approaches the end of her letter with the following. While I appreciate that Governor McCrory is advocating for a 1% raise for teachers in the coming school year, it is simply not enough. For me, that's $380, which after years of pay freezes does not cover the negative change in my health coverage and copays. It does not cover the change in the cost of a gallon of milk, a gallon of heating oil, or a unit of electricity. It is not enough. A sobering fact. Even a 20% pay raise would fall short of bringing me up to the 2007 pay scale for my current step, and that's in $2007. My students deserve a great experienced teacher. As a professional with 2 degrees and 4 certifications, I deserve to make an honest living serving my community and this state. Respectfully, Lindsay First. I guess that about says it, doesn't it? Pretty powerful. As I mentioned before reading Lindsay's letter, I looked over and read a number of the comments from people to that letter. I'm sure many of you have comments. I would love to hear them. Again, our phone number, area code 304-658-3333. I know that many of you pick up the program after the fact, late on iPods and archive off the archive and various other ways. And so you'll be responding. You'll be hearing about the letter and responding, not in the same time frame. I understand that. But in looking at the comments to the letter, a couple of things. One is that a couple of the comments were from other teachers in North Carolina who, unlike Lindsay, were not willing to put their own name on their comment for reasons related to job security. And one of the things they were suggesting is that in the course of the transition, when Lindsay came to North Carolina in 2007, one of the comments referred to the retirement system that teachers had in North Carolina, which has undergone a substantial change. North Carolina teachers, this teacher reminded all of us and responded directly to Lindsay, North Carolina teachers at one time, were in a defined pension retirement program, which means that after a certain number of years of service, they could retire and know exactly what their per month or per pay period retirement pay was going to be, along with the fringe benefits, health coverage, and various other things associated with it. But not too long before Lindsay went there, the comment was made. North Carolina teachers shifted from a defined benefit pension program to a defined contribution benefit program. What we have referred to on this program earlier as transition to the idea of a 401k or something equivalent. It may be called something different in North Carolina, but it's what we know, most of us know, as a 401k. And what it means is the individual teacher now owns their retirement package. So the assumption is that the upside of that is that if you leave the system or you leave teaching or you go with a different employer or move to a different state, you can take your retirement package, your 401k with you. It's yours. It's your retirement plan. But the fact of the matter is, when the transition was made from defined benefit pension program to a defined contribution program, that meant that the employer, in this case the state of North Carolina, or the local school system, would make a contribution to each teacher's retirement system. And the letter writer made the point that several years ago, the state of one of the efforts to cut back on expenses in North Carolina was that the state stopped making contributions to the teacher retirement system a few years ago, with the result that the 401k that the teacher owns is totally the teacher's own money once the change was made. The state of North Carolina requires its teachers to have a retirement program, but no longer contributes anything to that retirement, which effectively means, and the letter writer made this point, which effectively means that the state of North Carolina requires its teachers to have a savings account in which all the money that goes in, the teacher puts in. There is no way in the world that I know about and the world that you know about that a teacher on a pay scale that Lindsay addressed in her letter is going to be able to contribute enough to a retirement system that's going to allow the teacher to retire to any kind of a living wage. So in a sense, that I would suggest to you, I'm going back to our program from a couple of weeks ago, because at that time I suggested this as a possibility. The transition from defined benefit programs to defined contribution programs was a way to take the responsibility away off the employer for making a fixed contribution to employee retirement. By transitioning into the 401k system, employers for a time continued to make substantial contributions to retirement programs of individual employees, in this case teachers. But the contribution was voluntary, not mandatory. It was no longer state law. It was no longer state law that an employer had to make a defined contribution to the individual retirement system of each employee. Employers were encouraged to do that, but there was no legal mandate to do that. And clearly what has happened in North Carolina is that the state has chosen to take advantage of the fact that there is no required contribution by law to the retirement plan. So now the retirement system has become totally the teacher's responsibility. That is not unique to North Carolina. It is not unique to education. That's the model that has happened in employer-employee relationships in different industries and different places throughout the country. The transition, and I have to say this, the transition began in 1986 during the administration of Ronald Reagan in what is called, and if you Google this, you will find that most of the comments refer to this as the Tax Reform Act of 1986. And much of this is considered to be reform. But the real input, the priority input into this legislative change at the national level was employer input. And the idea was that facing international competition, facing competition from places like Asia, from South Korea and Japan and South America and the Middle East and India and Pakistan and all of these places that had computers and computer access and now were able, in a changing world, in a changing technological world, our competition was coming from places that heretofore never could compete. And in the face of that competition, corporate America was able to put the pressure on government to free the employer from these kinds of pension responsibilities, defined pension responsibilities to their own employees. And the assumption was that the money saved by removing the requirement on the employer, the money saved would enable the producer or the company at issue to be more competitive and more successful in the international market. And the belief was that this was government support for business, the benefits of which would flow back to us in more jobs and an increased standard of living because of the ability of American manufacturers and American producers to compete more effectively in the world marketplace. And for a while that worked. Many of us know that during the early years of the Clinton administration in the 1990s, the American economy generally was flying in terms of its ability to compete successfully throughout the world. But as we look back in hindsight, you know, the old idea that hindsight's always 20/20. As we look back, we begin to see that many companies, many employers didn't put the money saved from the Tax Reform Act of '86 into the competitive opportunities available in the world market, the benefits of which would come back to us. Instead, many employers took the opportunity to use that money to reward stockholders. And I don't have anything against stockholders. That's what makes free enterprise go, is the willingness of people to invest capital in the success of companies. But the fact of the matter is, when employees put the benefit to their stockholders as their number one priority always, especially when that's accompanied by a transition in the whole world of finance, which seems to have transitioned into short-term gain, short-term accountability, where people are looking at the value of stock in particular companies, not on a year-to-year basis or even on a quarter-by-quarter basis, not even on a month-to-month basis, but on a day-to-day basis. In fact, with high-speed computer training, day trading as it's called, people are making their living looking at the changes in stock values by the hour, not by the day, not by the week, not by the month, not by the quarter, not by the year, not by the decade. Can you imagine where we've come as a result of this letter from Lindsay on teaching? How significant is this to the nature of our economy, to the nature of our political system, to the responsibilities of government to, quote, promote the general welfare? The thinking in the mid-'80s was that promoting the general welfare was to promote the priority interests of business, with the idea that the money saved would be plowed back into the competitive marketplace to the point that the benefits would flow back to employees and to society at large. America's middle class would flourish as a result of the ability of its employers, major employers, to compete successfully around the world in a much more competitive world, the world that Tom Friedman and others set out to define for us. But instead of that, the money was diverted, the savings were diverted. People began to play the market. The result is, from the mid-'80s, as a result of the Tax Reform Act, the Dow Jones Industrial Average went up and up and up and up and up and up as more and more of this money was pouring into stocks. Literally, employers were gambling with the money that used to go into employee retirement systems. And as long as the market continued to respond favorably, the economy continued to go up. Everything looked good. But as we know, stocks don't go up forever. We know that from 1929. We know that from 2007. And when the recession hit, many of these people that were left holding 401ks took blows from being invested in the stock market, being invested in a system that few of them understood, few of them ever had the chance to even learn about. And so what we witnessed was a situation where the few flourished and the many took a beating. And it was done in complicity, it seems to me, with government. Now, whether you can say that government was naive, or whether this was whether this was a plan, or whether in fact business lobbyists, the K Street lobbyists, the growth of lobbyists, and the ability of corporate America to influence government and influence legislation, you can go any way you want here. But the fact of the matter is the transition, and it's laid out in this letter that Lindsay sent to the North Carolina legislature. And Lindsay herself didn't speak to this. Her colleagues, her teaching colleagues in North Carolina who knew about this spoke to this. She didn't even know about it. In other words, not only did her salary only go up $1,000 in 6 years, what she doesn't know is the nature of her retirement system had changed dramatically during the early years of this millennium, in ways that she doesn't even know about, because she's a young parent. She's not at this point thinking necessarily about retirement and about the differences between defined benefit programs and defined contribution programs and all the rest of it. But we are. And it seems to me, as we seek to try to understand the nature of our system, what we are finding is an awful lot of things are happening to people within our nation that are very, very negative. I think that many people are operating from a playbook that used to work, but no longer does. A few people are benefiting from it, but the vast numbers of people are not. And one of the ironies, we're at 52 minutes after the hour, so we only have another 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll be taking a break at the end of our first hour. I'm reminded of a piece that I read over the weekend by one of Warren Buffett's sons. And many of you may know that Warren Buffett, a few years ago, turned over to the Gates Foundation and other such philanthropic organizations much of his personal fortune. And in the process, he created separate foundations for each of his children to manage. And this op-ed piece in the New York Times over the weekend was written by one of those sons. And it was, I don't know anything about philanthropy because I don't have the kind of resources that would allow me to be a philanthropist. But it seems to me all of us need to become more aware of what's going on in the world of philanthropy. And more specifically, what's going on in the financial world of nonprofits. And this was the message that Warren Buffett's son was sharing with the world in the New York Times. That more and more we're coming to the kind of a world where the Warren Buffetts and the Bill Gateses and the others who are willing to give back to the community are becoming keys to our ability to address many of our problems. Because the economic benefits that many of us look for the many have not materialized. What has happened instead is that the few rather than the many are reaping the benefits of what's happening in today's world of finance. I think that the President, Barack Obama, spoke last week to this in his economic message last Wednesday, when he talked about the fact that we have rebounded from the depths of the recession to a point. But the fact of the matter is, the 1% are reaping most of the benefits of that recovery, while the middle class is still getting pounded. Something is wrong. And what Barack Obama is laying out, or seems to be in the process of laying out, is an agenda for his last 1,200 days in office, in which he wants government to assume its rightful place in doing something about this by moving in and becoming much more involved and a much more active player in promoting the general welfare, which, if you recall, is one of the missions of this government under the Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. Part of what we have inherited is that we are becoming more and more dependent on the very wealthy to take care of more and more of our social needs and our political needs in this nation. Because increasingly, the vast majority of us can't do it. Because we're like Lindsay. We're just basically struggling from check to check, and we see our pension plans changing and our retirement plans changing, and the idea of moving from one profession to another, no matter how good we are at it. We claim that education is our priority, that education is our future, and here's a plea from one of our best teachers suggesting that she's being driven out of the profession because of the imbalance that we seem to have in our priorities as a nation. It is just astounding. A baseball player, professional baseball player, who by default has admitted to violating the rules governing the use of drugs and growth enhancements. I'm speaking of Braun of the Milwaukee Brewers. Admits to that just after signing a $120 million contract. Can you imagine anybody? And the next target in this professional baseball's investigation is going to hit the New York Yankees, seemingly, with the third baseman who has yet to play this year, who signed a 10-year contract for $265 million in 6 years ago. Lindsay's leaving teaching because she's received a $1,000 pay increase over a 6-year period and is unaware of what has happened at the same time with her retirement program. That's something she hasn't had the opportunity to even address as yet. Tell me that our national priorities are in order. Tell me that some change isn't necessary. Tell me that the world is different out there. It is absolutely essential that, and I'm not saying middle class, but the people of this country begin to demand access to the decisions which directly affect their lives. And in order to do that, they must know. And in order to do that, they have to have access to a voice like this one. Not necessarily this program. I'm not vain enough to say that. But I can't say it and mean it when I mention the Horn specifically. A network which gives people the opportunity to learn and to know things that they never had the opportunity to learn or to know. but more than that, to interact and discuss and to relate and to clarify and to get their arms around and to talk to other people who are in similar circumstances, to investigate and lay out the ingredients of a problem and begin to speculate on possible solutions to these problems, instead of relying on letting the traditional few, the 1%, who cause the problem, who are causing the problems, make the decisions to fix the problems. Not only does our education system have to change, not only does an education system which functions around the exclusion of 3 out of every 4 of our young people, if you think about it, from real opportunity. But then turning to those that are making the most money from this system to make the changes to fix it. Talk about the old idea of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Think about this letter. Think about the number of other people in teaching and various other professions who could write the same kind of letter and say the same kinds of things. It is absolutely incredible. It is absolutely vital that we continue to speak, we continue to talk. As Bob Kincaid says over and over again on the horn, it is important to keep the conversation going, keep the conversation alive. As long as people are talking, solutions are possible. When people stop communicating, solutions become impossible. We're at 2 minutes after the hour. Let's pause and take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll continue, and we'll get into a little bit of 19th century labor history, pending, of course, a call from you at 304-658-3333. This is a wonderful time to put in that call and make yourself heard. We would love to hear from you. This is Bill O'Brien. You're tuned into the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution, and in 5 minutes we'll be back with our second hour. Thank you very much, and welcome back to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. It is 7 minutes after the hour. I am Bill O'Brien, and again, I have to say that it is a pleasure to be with you once again on this beautiful day in late July on the Horn. I mean that very, very sincerely. If you've been with us since the top of our program, a little bit better than an hour ago, thank you for staying with us. We appreciate that. And if you are just joining us, welcome, and thank you for tuning in, for your patronage not only to the Virtual Center, but to the Horn, to the Head-On Radio Network itself. If you are just tuning in, you probably didn't hear the end of the last hour, but the fact that the conversation that drives the Head-On Radio Network, the conversation that it is all about, must continue. And I think in the letter we looked at during our first hour, that becomes very, very clear. I wanted to return in our second hour. First of all, I want to make sure that everybody has the phone number, because we do encourage you to give us a call and share your thinking with us. The area code is 304, and the number is 658-3333.
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob?
Before you jump in, I think Betsy has a comment for you.
Sure, I'd love to hear it. Thank you, Bob.
Right. Stand by.
Hello?
Hello, Betsy.
Hey, how are you?
How are you?
I'm good. So I think I took a different thing away from that letter than you did.
Wonderful. I'd love to hear it.
So the thing that jumped out at me is that here is a professional teacher with 2 degrees. I'm assuming that's bachelor's and master's, like what I have.
Right.
And 4 teaching certificates, which is also the same thing that I have. Who has now been teaching for 6 years, full-time job.
Right.
And her children are on Medicaid.
Okay. Go ahead.
This is a healthcare issue as much as it is anything else.
Betsy, you're exactly right. It's a healthcare issue. It's a priority issue. It's a national priority issue. It seems to me it speaks to the whole nature of a, for lack of a better term, a screwed up system of priorities in this country. I mean, as you say, here is a professional in a profession that we all acknowledge is going to be critical to our to the survival of our way of life as a nation and a quality of life. And here's one of the best being forced to leave the profession because of the kind of inadequate support that society is willing to give her. And the fact that her children are on Medicaid is a perfect example of that. You're right. It's amazing.
I mean, that was what struck me was this is the problem.
Oh yeah, it is. And the fact that it's not done yet. I don't know if you have been. I've been doing a little bit of reading about some of the things that are going on in North Carolina right now. North Carolina is becoming, is in the forefront of some of the most negative stuff that is happening in terms of budgets. Go ahead.
I would say they're copying Texas on the reproductive health, which is really scary just by itself.
Oh, and the reduction in budgets and health programs and job security and everything else is in the forefront of what's happening in North Carolina. And I don't know whether this, many media folks are suggesting that this might be the first in an unending series of directions in states. On the other hand, we're beginning to see that there's a building groundswell to doing something about this, and I think that we have to find a way to encourage that.
I think so too.
Betsy, thanks. Thank you so very much. Thank you for the letter. You're the one that sent me the letter. I want to thank you.
I am. Well, a friend posted it to her Facebook wall, and I looked at it and I was like, this is exactly what Dr. Bill has been talking about.
Oh my God, yeah, it is amazing, and it is so sad. It is so sad because it's happening everywhere, and as states, are looking squarely at budget deficits, as places like Detroit is applying, is applying for bankruptcy, for God's sake. I mean, what is going to happen to us as a society and if we don't do something and do something fast?
We are going down the hill so quickly, and so many people haven't noticed it.
No, and it's happening piecemeal, and that's why I think this issue of labor and labor management relations is such an important one to look at, because the whole idea of divide and conquer is laid out there in spades. It's there for everybody to see. That was the strategy that was laid out at the very beginning. But the idea was that what divide and conquer does is guarantee who makes the decisions. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the decisions have to be disastrous ones. But that's the direction we're heading in now.
Right. Can I put up another issue that's related?
Betsy, go right ahead.
So this is a hypothesis. Students are leaving school now knowing less and less and less about the world around them. And this is what with your discussion of the focus on STEM, but also the focus on testing and test results.
Yes.
And I have a theory that with schools that, like the one I was in, have at least half of every day, if not all of every day, devoted to testing and test prep. One of the things that, besides social studies disappearing from the curriculum, the other piece that has disappeared completely is current events. Mm-hmm. We are not teaching kids to watch even the corporate news. We are not teaching them to pay any attention to newspapers. as little as 10 years ago, I was in schools where there was a newspaper for every teacher every morning that you were expected to have in your classroom.
Right.
If you wanted a class set, they were free. You ordered them. The local newspaper actually pays for them. They're completely 100% free to classes, to teachers. That program still exists, but at least here, nobody has time for current events, so those newspapers sit in the library if they get delivered at all.
Right. Right. You touch on there's so many pieces to that one, but you're exactly right. And of course, the idea of social studies and knowing what happened in the past is part of understanding what's going on right now. But as you say, there's no emphasis on what's going on right now.
Right. There's absolutely not.
And you know, do you? And this is. Yeah, I don't know that it's possible to answer this. I'm asking your opinion more than anything else. Do you feel that it's the emphasis on testing that is causing this, or do you feel that if we weren't testing the way we're testing, we'd find some other way to affect this?
I think the bulk of it is probably not testing.
Yeah. You know, we're turning out, as you said in your lead, we're turning out people who know less and less about what's going on around them, and they're being
less and less about everything.
They're being encouraged to not care.
Right.
And they're being, in effect, they're being encouraged to take solace in the fact that the people who do care will make the decisions, the appropriate decisions at the appropriate time, so they need not worry about these things. Somebody's taking care of it for them. And I see this tied up with the idea of of what's happening to our privacy, the whole issue of cell phone and email and all this other stuff that came out during as a result of Edward Snowden. I mean, I see all of this. People, I mean, the fact that there hasn't been an absolute explosion of public opinion in terms of what's happening.
People expect no privacy.
No.
I mean, we had I don't know if she called or wrote into the horn, a young lady who's 21 years old, maybe, Princeton student, who talked about how none of her friends, she's never had privacy between family members who had the right to read and listen, read her text and read her email, to schools that told them at least once a semester, everything you do through your school account is watched. They never expected privacy. They had no privacy in their things at school. She has no idea what privacy is. This is a kid who's at Princeton, has no idea what privacy is, and why on earth would she expect it from her government?
Right. And not only that, but people are encouraged, or at least it is suggested, that people who are demanding their privacy are in one way or another are suspicious.
Right.
There's got to be a reason why they don't want us to know. And if they didn't have anything to hide, then they wouldn't be making such a big issue of this.
Exactly.
I mean, it is unbelievable. You're right.
But they don't expect, and my son is the same age, and he doesn't, No,
the assumption...
He thinks that privacy is an ideal. It would never occur to him that privacy is a right.
Is a right. And not...
He thinks that it's an ideal. Yeah, well, because, his experience with me growing up in this house is that things are private until I'm suspicious, and I don't have to go to a judge. Yeah. I get suspicious, and I pull up his internet activity on the computer, or I get suspicious, and I log into my service provider, my phone provider, and I check what he's been doing.
Yeah, yeah.
So...
that's part of raising young people, but on the other hand, it's a national agenda in our society today. and I
Yeah.
agree with you.
But I think that that's part of why people don't, why there's not an uprising over this.
I know that
nobody expects privacy.
No. As far as your current events comment, and I know Bob Kincaid and I have talked about this numerous times, but one of the things that I've noticed in the professions, for example, is that at one time, and of course, at one time, foreign policy, international affairs, was a major in political science and in history, and universities used to hire people whose specialization was international affairs and foreign policy. And as those people have retired or died, they have not been replaced. And entire major departments at universities have no focus any longer in international affairs and foreign policy or whatever. And I choose to see this as a reaction against the 1960s. Foreign policy and international affairs is not something that decision makers believe that the general population should be even aware of or involved in. And that's exactly what's happening.
Well, good luck in any newspaper in America finding out anything that's happening outside that's not related to the Royal Navy.
People in the world, throughout the world, are basically acknowledging, it's generally accepted, that the American people are the least informed people about the world of any major nation in the world.
So you remember I called you before I started working on the Constitution with my fifth graders at the end of the school year?
Yes, I do.
So one of the things, and I think I sent you pictures, I took pictures of their answers. One of the things I did as we started our study of the Constitution is I asked them, I gave them 3 questions. Number 1, list 5 important dates that are important in United States history and say 1 sentence about why it's important.
Right.
Number 2 was list 5 important people who are important to the history of the United States and tell why they're important. And number 3, what do you know about the Constitution? Write as much as you can.
Right.
These were 20 of the smartest kids, or at least the highest performing kids of the grade. Of those 20, nobody got all 5, any 5, on parts 1 and 2, and nobody wrote anything that was correct about number 3.
Nobody?
11 years old. Nobody. Not one.
Nobody knew anything about the Constitution.
Nobody. One person said it's the Declaration of Independence. One person said it's a Constitution, it's for the United States. Most people left it blank.
Yeah. Oh.
They had never heard of it.
Did you?
And we mentioned it earlier in the year when we looked at the 3 branches of government when we were preparing for elections.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't say this is in the Constitution. I mean, I didn't specifically.
Right.
That wasn't my focus. Was that this was Constitution? So.
I'm wondering if people out there are thinking about the results of that the results of that experiment. Not one person, the brightest youngsters.
So this is of a class of 93 kids. These are the 20 who scored the highest on their standardized test.
Right.
The 20 highest maybe the 24 highest out of 93.
Right. It speaks to a real problem. It obviously does more than speak to it. It demonstrates, as you say, that people don't know or are encouraged to not care about these issues because somebody's taking care of them. Somebody is making the decisions.
Right.
It's frightening because that's the message. Is that all you need to do is worry about getting a job and and doing well on these competitive tests, so that you personally will succeed. You personally will be able to take care of yourself, because the other things in life somebody is taking care of for you.
So even if these kids, when they get there, their 11th grade teacher does a fantastic job on United States history and government, right? So they get 11th grade and then they get half of 12th grade for history and government. Even if they have the best teachers, how much are these kids going to care when they graduate about whether the NSA is listening to their phone calls?
Exactly right, or anything else. But and many of the things that are happening, they don't even, and I don't mean things that are happening in international affairs around them, but many of the things that are happening to them in terms of their future potential, their retirement, everything. One of the things that I'm concerned personally about, I don't mean personally, but one of the issues that really bothers me is that with the transition to 401ks, the transition to individual responsibility for people's own retirement systems, and the removal of a portion of that responsibility from employers, one of the results of that is that individuals have been encouraged to put aside more and more and more of their day-to-day operating capital, of their money, for their future.
It's not only a pay cut, it feeds Wall Street. It's a pay cut. It's money that goes directly from what we should expect to take home and goes directly to Wall Street, that we may or may not ever see a return on.
We'll be back with the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution just as quickly as we sort out this brief technical aggravation. After a less brief than I would have liked technical annoyance, we now rejoin Dr. Bill O'Brien, already in progress. Hi, Dr. Bill.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it, and welcome back to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. It's 41 minutes after the hour. We still have close to 20 minutes left of programming, and I did want to continue with our move into labor in the 19th century. And given the time constraints and various other things, I think it might be a good idea to kind of lay out the context for a discussion that we will begin with on tomorrow's program at the Virtual Center. The issue that I wanted to raise in order to address the issues related to labor, the first issue that I wanted to introduce is the concept or the idea of paternalism. We talked about this before in a number of different situations and different venues. But I would suggest to you that the emergence of American labor, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in America, began in the context of a society which for a long time had been based upon the traditional concepts of paternalism. Most of us understand the nature of the word paternalism. We think of the relationship between parents, father and son. And there's no better place to go for a look at 18th and early 19th century paternalism than Gordon Wood's Pulitzer Prize-winning Radicalism of the American Revolution. In his chapter on republicanism in America, Gordon Wood has an entire section on what he calls enlightened paternalism. And it is out of this context that the Industrial Revolution surfaces in America, and it is with paternalistic assumptions that labor movement develops in the early 19th century. So if I may, let me go for a little bit of background, a little bit of context to Gordon Wood, and let's look at what Gordon Wood talks about when he talks about enlightened paternalism. I'm going to read a section from Gordon Wood. Even in terms of the more traditional patriarchal society, Wood says, the relation between fathers and children, masters and servants, rulers and ruled, had always been described as mutual. Inferiors obviously had obligations to their superiors, but so too did superiors have a responsibility to respect the rights of their subordinates. For, as Samuel Willard had written, quote, they are no more left by the word of God to be despotical than the others to be disobliged. English rulers could not rely on standing armies or companies of guards to frighten and compel people into obedience. Obedience by compulsion, wrote William Livingston in 1752, is the obedience of vassals, who without compulsion would disobey. The affection of the people is the only source of a cheerful and rational obedience. Unlike rulers everywhere, English superiors had to gain the natural affection and respect of their inferiors and their dependents. They had to be enlightened and liberal, befitting Englishmen. Yet in the colonies, particularly by mid-century, now this is mid-18th century, the more those in authority sought to earn the esteem of those below them, the more fearful and resentful their subordinates became. Somehow, duties and obligations hitherto taken for granted by masters and subordinates were now open to doubt. Traditional social bonds were coming apart, and authority lost confidence in its ability to hold them together. This is the 18th century background to American independence, and the point that I wanted to make is that this idea of paternalism is part and parcel of what society is about in the 18th century, and it continues to exist, albeit less and less so, in the 19th century. And it is within the context of this paternalistic background that industrial America emerges. We had talked in a previous program about the beginnings of manufacturing primarily in New England, with the development of the textile mills in the early 19th century in New England. We talked about the Waltham system. We talked about the Boston Manufacturing Company and its adoption of what becomes a Waltham system, which is a system which one must appreciate as paternalistic in order to really understand. The issue that I want to share with you as we move towards the end of our program today, as a lead-in for continuation of this discussion, is that industrialism in America in the early years of the 19th century had not yet adopted the ideas of exploitation of labor by management that we tend to associate with the Industrial Revolution. The evils of industrialism as it was underway in Europe during this period, in Great Britain. Think of Charles Dickens's Hard Times in order to really get a view of the worst aspects of industrialism. As industry developed in the New World, as manufacturing was introduced from the old world in the new, in the development of these textile mills in New England, the thinking was in the New World that the benefits of manufacturing could be introduced into the New World, into America, without adopting also the negatives that were associated with industrialism in the old world. In other words, we could perfect manufacturing in America by adopting all the good aspects of it and eliminating all the bad. Part of that meant that the traditions of paternalism that was so much a part of the colonial period in America and through the period of the Revolution and into the Constitution up until the end of the 19th century, the ideal relationship between parents and children, between rulers and ruled, was one of paternalism, was one where both sides, employer and employees both, had rights as well as responsibilities. Each had responsibilities to the other. And the assumption was that if each fulfilled his obligations, the result would be an improved manufacturing capability that could develop without the evils of old world exploitation and industrialism. That was the plan. The Waltham system was an effort to introduce that plan into the New World by the Boston Manufacturing Company and its officials. Obviously, manufacturing, industry required labor. And the thinking of those in positions of decision-making was that the greatest potential labor to an industrial system would come from the daughters of New Englanders living outside the cities of New England itself. In other words, if we could persuade parents to send their daughters to us in order to work in the mills, we would have produced, we would have taken advantage of our own internal labor system. But in order to make that work, we had to be able to promise the parents of these girls something in return. And what the Boston Manufacturing Company, what the Waltham system was based upon, is the paternalistic reciprocal relationship between industry and employee that produced what history continues to term or call the Lowell girls. The young women who came to work in the mills, not only for employment purposes from the perspective of the employer, but for cultural experiences and cultural advancement from the position of the parents of these girls. More specifically, associated with each of these textile mills was company housing, boarding houses under the supervision of a house mother who would control the non-working hours of these girls. They would live in supervised housing. They would be guaranteed healthful, quality meals. They would be promised cultural advantages and benefits. They would be taught culture. They would be taught manners. They would be taught skills. They would be educated. They would be exposed to quality literature. They would be exposed to good music. They would be exposed to the theater. All of this was part of the reciprocal deal. In return for their labor, these girls would be educated into becoming refined, sophisticated young ladies. All they had to do for it was put in their time in the mills. Most of them began by reporting for work at 5:30 a.m. and would work 6 days a week until 7 p.m. There would be a break at 7 a.m. for breakfast provided by the employer, for a lunch hour. There would be breaks during the day, scheduled breaks. But the fact of the matter is, these girls would be looked upon as the wards of the employer. Their upbringing, their culture, their education, the things that were promised to the parents in order to get the parents to trust their daughters to leave home and move to the big city and work for a living. And of course, part of this was all the rhetoric associated with the values associated with working. The idea of responsibility, the idea of interacting with other young women from around New England, and the sophistication that would come from that. All of these things became part and parcel of what the employer had to promise in order to gain access to a quality workforce. The assumption was, the reciprocal relationship was, in return for quality service and work came sophistication and education. One of the most beneficial, rewarding experiences is to read the records of what was going on in these mills. Read about the experiences. Read the advertising. Many of the girls in some of these mills put out their own publications. They wrote their own poetry. They wrote their own short stories. They issued publications. There's a whole wealth of primary source materials coming out of this New England experience of early manufacturing. But the issue that explained it all was the paternalistic relationship between employer and employee, which made the whole system go. The question that we confront is what happened? What caused paternalism and responsibility to be replaced by exploitation? And one of the realities was the very nature of immigrant labor, access to immigrant labor. By bringing in immigrants, cheap labor, the thinking was that the profit motive of employers could be improved. In other words, the bottom line would be benefited by the importation of immigrant labor, foreign labor, in order to supplement the supply of domestic labor. And it's not too many years down the road before we see examples of union organizing among the Lowell girls. And indeed, strikes. Because what was happening was that employers began to introduce pay cuts, substantial pay cuts, 10%, 20%, in order to make the kind of profit that allowed being in business and delivering on some of the associated responsibilities with what being an employer in New England was about. It required pay cuts, and the introduction of immigrant labor threatened job security to the point that in several of these mills the girls began to strike. And the use of cheap immigrant labor to break strikes became part of the history of industrialism in early New England, and exploitation quickly replaced paternalism as the driving force of industrialism in America. It's 59 minutes after the hour. We'll pick up on this story. It's a fascinating story. And we'll move into the Industrial Revolution in America in the 19th century on tomorrow's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for listening. Apologize for the technology interruptions we had. We'll be back tomorrow, and we'll have all the bugs worked out, I promise. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for listening.